You're listening to Bad Dog Agility, bringing you training tips, interviews, and news about the great sport of dog agility. And now, here are your hosts, Sarah and Esteban.
I'm Esteban.
And I'm Sarah, and this is episode 179.
Today's podcast is brought to you by HittedBoard.com. HittedBoard.com has the innovative training tools you need for agility. Having problems with the dog walker A-frame? The Hitted Board can fix that. Your dog doesn't like tugging? They'll love the Tug It. Can't move your A-frame around by yourself? The Move It can. Go to HittedBoard.com and use discount code BDA10 to get 10% off your order. That's HittedBoard.com. Today's podcast is also brought to you by Elite Science. Unlock your dog's full potential with the unique competitive edge solution, 1TDC. 1-tetradecanol complex is a patented blend of unique fatty acid oils designed to safely and effectively keep joints and muscles at their best to maximize performance and shorten recovery time. 1TDC is the next generation of fatty acids and is used by many current and past national agility champions and world team members. All of our listeners will automatically qualify for a great 1TDC special offer by purchasing online at BDA1TDC.com. That's BDA, the number 1, TDC.com. Today, we're going to be answering the question that has been around since agility began. Which is faster, the front cross or the rear cross? This is a question that we get a lot by email, some version of this, which is better, the front or the rear, which is faster, the front or the rear. And the thing about this question is we're talking about a handling choice on course. The dog is going to take the same path, but to get the dog to take that path, should we use one maneuver or another? And this is really different from wrap choices, which we've talked about before, where the dog is going to turn left or turn right, and you're comparing two completely different dog paths. And so what I like to always say, kind of flippantly, I guess, when asked whether a front or a rear is faster, is that if you have perfect execution, and if your dog has perfect understanding and knows what you want, and if the dog drives to do what you want as quickly as possible, then the answer is the time should be exactly the same because the path is exactly the same. Yeah, this is a pretty interesting question. So let's think about it this way. If I sent out a survey to 1,000 different agility people and I said, for most dogs, which one is faster, front cross or rear cross? I think most people are going to say front cross. I think very few people, if any, are going to say rear cross. And I think you'll also have a group of people that say they're the same, for most dogs. And that's the interesting point here, that there's a perception among a large number of people that the front cross is faster, the superior move to the rear cross. And all things being equal, that should never be the case. It just doesn't make sense.
That's
given
right.
that the dog's path is the same.
Right. And that's the key bit. The dog's path is the same, or the dog's path should be the same. If the dog's path is not the same, something has gone wrong. The dog is going wider for some reason with one versus the other. But the thing about that statement that I set up was, it had a lot of ifs. If you execute perfectly, if your dog understands and responds, and if your dog drives. Well, those are three different places where there can be a breakdown in how an execution turns out in real life. Mm-hmm. But each of those things has kind of a different solution. So that's why I think it's interesting and worthwhile to really evaluate all those pieces of that statement.
Yeah. I think, again, going back to your 1,000 handler questionnaire, people are going to answer based on their own experience, right? With their own dog. So if they have a dog that runs better with front crosses, they're going to say front crosses. If they have a dog who can do both, they're more likely to say both. Even if they have a strong rear crossing dog, though, I think a lot of those people are still going to say fronts. And so again, it's just interesting. There's that perception out there in agility. And the big deal here is it's having a negative impact on the performance of many, many dogs.
Because if you think that one maneuver is always the better maneuver, and if you always reach for that maneuver, what never gets better? The other one, the one that you're never doing, never practicing, never reaching for in competition, the one that could be just as good if you put in the same amount of time and repetitions that you put in.
Right. And that assumes that you're always going to do a perfect front cross, right?
Well, I wanted to move on to that because that was kind of the first thing. If you have perfect execution. So there's this perception, like you said, front cross beats rear cross. But let me tell you, a good rear cross beats a bad front cross every day of the week.
Yeah, that's super, super important. I can't stress that enough. I think, frankly, it's Gitchy's not so secret to her success as far as being competitive with Border Collies. She simply isn't as fast as the dogs out there. If you look at competitions as recently as, March Nationals, right? AKC National Championship Final. You're in there with almost 30 dogs, and I would say at least half of the field is faster than her. At least, right? They can run a line faster than her. They can turn better than her, and they lost. And it wasn't just because of running contacts. There were other dogs out there, certainly with running contacts, or dogs with enough speed to make up the running contacts, but there were handlers out there that opted for front crosses that they couldn't execute very well. They weren't in very good position to make. And it created wide turns. And when I was able to rear cross in those situations and get very tight turns, suddenly you've closed that gap. So that dog's speed doesn't matter anymore. I've sliced into that time. And so now, as the handler who doesn't like to rear cross, you've given away some of your advantage, right? You have the faster dog and you're saying, well, I'm just going to do a not perfect front cross and let this slower dog beat me just because they can do a rear cross and I can't. It doesn't make sense to show up at a big event like that and not have that skill.
Right. So when we evaluate which is faster, a front cross or a rear cross, part of the evaluation has to be, can I do a good front cross and a good rear cross here? Because if I can do good on one and not so good on the other, just because of where I am on course or my speed or relative to the dog, that's going to give you a lot of information. And one thing that I like to say a lot is, I would consider myself, I lean on front crosses quite a bit, and especially in my early career, because, like I've said on some of the other podcasts, we're young, we're fit, we can run really fast, compared to our dog and compared to a lot of handlers. And so we would lean on these front crosses. And the more I learned about handling, the fewer front crosses that I did. It's not that I got worse at front crosses. It's that I got better at recognizing where I was forcing in a cross that I couldn't quite make in terms of timing and position.
Absolutely. I can remember specific runs from big events where I had bad front crosses and they, for a really fast dog, it's just going to cost you an off course. I remember being at the AKC Invitational one year, winning round one, getting pretty pumped up, thinking I was going to win every round and just blast my way through the finals, and then going off course in the next 3 rounds. And that was led off, I think, by an off course in number 2, trying to do a front cross before an A-frame. Just way too late. And the dog was over the jump before I even started turning toward the A-frame. Another good example, again, this is recent from the May tryouts. Tough front cross after a running dog walk onto like a 45-degree turn. Probably should have reared that spot. Just thought I could get there. And I think a lot of you out there know what I'm talking about. If you ever have to ask yourself the question, can I get there for that front cross? And so that's the position I was in. I put myself in a losing position. And again, she ends up going wide and we get a refusal there. So there was no off course. She made the turn. She just made it really, really late and poorly, and run by of the obstacle there. I think a rear would have served very nicely. So it's not like this is something that I've solved and I never make this mistake. There's still spots where I'm trying to figure out, well, what's better here, a rear or a front? What advantage am I gaining? What advantage am I losing? What's optimal here?
That's right. And, make no mistake, you can also do a poor rear cross as well. But there's so many people that seem to favor the front.
I'm not saying that a rear cross is
the end all be all.
Right. And it's going to fix your dog and suddenly you're going to win national championships,
But it seems to be the way that most people lean. And so those are the examples that we come up with. Also, I think just by its very nature, you can't always get into that position for that perfect front cross. But because the rear cross involves letting the dog get in front of you, you can pretty much always get into the position to set up that rear cross. So, it's one of those fallback moves where you can't always make that front. You can probably make the rear, if you are evaluating those two options. Now, one thing about the rear cross though is it doesn't work as well when it is an in the moment fallback, because we've all seen those handlers that wanted to do the front. They run up, realize they're not going to make it, and they slam on the brakes and try to do a rear. But the rear cross involves setting up that move several obstacles in advance. We don't necessarily want to be slamming on the brakes as our dogs are trying to drive in front of us. We want to kind of have it be a more gradual, the dog catching up, passing us, and going over the jump. So, the best rear cross is going to be planned out and executed over several obstacles.
Definitely. That also happened to me, I think, like 2 weekends ago. Last time I was at a trial, I was trying to come in, I think, for a blind cross, and then I just aborted. And then I was like, I'm just going to have to rear here. And of course, you're way up by the jump. You're at virtually a dead stop, and the dog has to rear there. So I think that was a little bit awkward.
So if we want to get better at the handler execution, how do we improve it? Well, it's going to be practice and video review. You want to be practicing your front crosses and your rear crosses. You want to be videotaping them. You want to be analyzing those videos so that you can see, am I really making that timing? Am I in the right position?
Well, yeah. And, the really important thing here, besides, doing it the right way, doing your fronts the right way, doing your rears the right way, is you can put them side by side and actually find out which one is better for you. And I think this is the one that's just so shocking to people. They do the side by side and then they see for this particular instance or this kind of sequence, the rear works better. And they had no idea. They've been doing agility 10, 15 years, 6 years with this dog. And suddenly they did this and now they're slicing out 5/6 of a second.
I just thought of the best analogy. Have you ever been in traffic? Mm-hmm. Where you had to wait through a traffic jam, right? Okay. And then you had to decide whether you were going to take a detour. And the detour was smooth sailing, but is a further distance, right? And sometimes that detour actually takes longer than sitting and suffering through that traffic. But it feels better because you're not so frustrated and stuff like that, right?
Right.
I think sometimes that's what happens with the front cross and the rear cross. Is with the front cross, it feels faster because the handler is moving the whole time.
It feels more aggressive. It feels more like championship agility. You're pushing, you're driving. There's a risk that you're not going to make it. So
and you, the handler, are running as fast as you can to make that, right? And you don't even necessarily see the widest turn that your dog got because you're concentrating on your footwork and your movement and everything. And the rear cross, because you, the handler, have to slow up, it feels like I'm not going as fast as I could. But it doesn't matter how fast the handler goes. It matters how fast the dog gets through the sequence. And that is where video review is key.
Right.
The other thing that will help the execution of front crosses specifically is if you want to make those front crosses, and if you find that you are not in that perfect position, your timing is not perfect, you're not getting to where you need to be, a lot of times the fix is not to your front cross. It is to something one or two obstacles back to put you further ahead. It is trusting your dog on a jump, 2 or 3 jumps back, letting them go do that while you race up ahead and get to that perfect position and get to that perfect timing. Mm-hmm. And so it's much more than just the isolated move.
Right. That's my number one fix right now, especially when you look at more experienced handlers and tougher courses, national level courses, international kind of courses. Oftentimes they're going to get to a spot and say, I have to do it this way because I don't have whatever skill, XYZ skill. This is the only way it can be done. And as you can see, I simply can't get there in time. And then, there's the unspoken, and therefore I can't do this kind of course, or this kind of course is no good for me. So what I like to do in those spots is say, okay, I concede, sure, you got to do it this specific way. And in order to do it that way, you need to be right there. But just like Sarah said, I'm going to look at the jump before, and really I look at the two obstacles before. And I say, what's a way we can cheat? What's a way we can get some lateral distance, some just straight up distance? How can we leave a little bit earlier so we can better position ourselves to be there for that obstacle? So we don't just look at that spot and say, okay, well, now you can't front there. You can front there if you can get there sooner. Now let's back up a couple obstacles and see where we can cut out some handler yardage. And you can almost always come up with a very good solution there. And that's something that I think, not everyone's doing. Let me just put it that way. Not everyone's doing.
All right, so let's move on from that perfect handler execution that we need if we want to get this ideal, dog path is the same, therefore time is the same. And the next part was if the dog has perfect understanding and knows what you want. So there is, another half of the team, right? There's the handler, there's the dog. So even if your execution is good, we need our dog to be equally skilled. We need them to be equally skilled with the front cross and the rear cross if we want to get this ability to really get the most out of either maneuver. So, and here's where you're going to get some personality of the dog or tendencies of the dog that come in here. So, front crosses are a very, what I would call an in-your-face move. So some dogs get better turns on front crosses because the handler is right there. The handler is almost forcing the dog to turn tighter, sometimes is forcing the dog to turn tighter by the very physical presence of their bodies in a certain spot on course.
Oh, right.
It forces the dog's path.
Yeah. Even if you're ahead of your dog, obviously you're going to create certain lines and you're going to do it from ahead. So you're going to narrow the window for your dog to approach. So your turns will certainly be better controlled. So there are a lot of times I will choose fronts over rears because there are, let's say I'm approaching a turn, like a 45 to 90 degree turn, but there are 2 or 3 off courses, right? That's a pretty poor spot for a rear because you're going to have to, the dog cycles through each of those courses. Let's say they're going to spend 1/10 of a second saying, okay, it's not the first one. Another 1/10 of a second. Okay, it's not the second one. Okay, it's the third one. But if I'm up there for a front cross, by the time I finish the front cross, I've removed 2 of the choices and really there's only the correct choice left. And so the dog doesn't have to do any thinking. All of those choices are taken away from the dog while the dog is engaged with the jump, basically jumping or landing. And now I've shown them the way. So in those spots, I really, really want a front cross there.
That's right. And, a rear cross, even without the presence of traps, a rear cross may cue the same next correct obstacle, but there is nothing physically forcing the dog's path. And so they may take a slightly wider approach to the next obstacle, even though their understanding is great, even though the cue is timely and they know what it means. There's nothing that is forcing them to, let's say, land, dig in hard, turn, and accelerate out of that turn the way a front cross might. And so, without that physical presence, they may take, one stride in kind of a more general arc rather than a land, cut, dig, turn kind of
I think this
response.
is this is personal opinion is just that it's a very, very small percent of dogs like that who generally don't turn well. They take all jumps in extension. Maybe their foundation training wasn't very good. And maybe they're just that kind of dogs. Just some dogs really like to jump far and long and fast and do all their turning on the flat rather than, checking their stride before the takeoff.
That's right. And then kind of in the same vein of the dog execution. So we talked about handler execution. Now we're talking about the dog execution is, with a front cross, the handler is interrupting the flow a little bit by breaking that connection that the dog has with the course. And so you may see more bars on front cross depending on the dog. So these are things you want to figure out. Are there certain front cross situations where that little bit of disconnect that I add to this equation causes my dog to knock a bar. But then on the rear cross, the dog loses sight of the handler. And so sometimes you get some disconnect there. There are dogs that when you rear cross them, it's like permission to do whatever I want. And not at the highest levels, but especially kind of the newer dogs that are very distractible anyway. You rear cross, they lose sight of you, and it's time for them.
Gone.
Right, the magic's gone. That tenuous connection that you had with your dog is broken, and that's when you kind of lose them. So those are kind of the dog dependent factors that come in.
Sure. Is this a place to talk about bar knocking? Because I just thought of it. Gitchy's a little bit of a bar knocker. When I'm looking to keep bars up, I am more likely to select a rear cross. I know from counting that she has a higher knock rate on front crosses, or the majority of her bars, I should say, are on front crosses. The majority are actually backsides and throttles, but the next most common thing is going to be front cross much more than rear. And so this is my theory. It's related to what Sarah says about the handler being in the way or not in the way. And that's on a rear cross. Let's say you're approaching a jump. They turn 90 degrees to the right. The handler, it never blocks the dog's view of the jump after the turn, right? That jump is always in view from the moment they take off for the jump before. So in my mind, the dog is kind of lining up both jumps at the same time. Now, the front cross is not the same at all. What are you doing? You're rushing into that spot, completely obstructing the dog's view. And depending on where you finish your front cross, right? You may be taking them this way or that way. I've read articles in Clean Run, and a lot of other handlers do it, where their front crosses are not, they do like different degrees. Like sometimes their front cross, you turn sharp, sometimes not. But the dog never really knows till you're headed in that direction. And that whole time, really, the only jump they could take is just the one jump in isolation. Then they have to go to the next jump, right? And so that creates a lot of bar knocking there as they feel like there's a loss of space. They're not connecting this jump and the next jump and then planning the best possible path between jumps 1 and 2. Instead, they have to take jump 1 in isolation, land, and then wait for you to finish your front cross.
And a lot of times it's the bar after the front cross that falls because the dog doesn't have enough time to prepare for the spacing.
It's suddenly there.
It's suddenly there. And that's why a lot of times, I know you specifically, if the spacing feels a little more cramped than usual, like let's say when you were jumping 26, yes, in a ring that was maybe a little bit smaller and yes, everything's a little bit more compressed, you are going to reach for that rear cross to give the dog as much leeway for figuring out their striding as you possibly can.
That's a great rule of thumb. I will tell you that right now. If you're on a technical course, and a technical course, technical in the context of agility just means you're doing lots of turns and side changes, especially on a slippery surface. It's tight and you got a big dog, 20, 24 inch, 26 inch. I'll tell you right now, you should be doing mostly rears. All right. Unless your dog is extremely athletic, you are going to take some bars. You're going to take some wide turns. You're going to get a lot of off courses. You see this happen every year at events like the Invitational and the Nationals.
All right. So there's one final key that I think this is really the nail in the coffin of the idea that front cross and rear cross should be identical because the path is identical. And that is that it turns out that a number of dogs, and I would actually say it's a pretty large proportion of dogs, just don't run as fast with the rear cross. And that's a drive and a confidence issue, because if the dog knows where they're going.
So when you say nail in the coffin of the idea, so you're saying that the two are not equivalent.
Right. I'm saying that for a lot of people, without addressing the issue of confidence and drive, they will see slower times, because the key difference comes in because what we said, our initial thesis or hypothesis that we have been working on is if the dog path is the same, the speed should be the same. But there was a big if in there. If the dog path is the same and the dog runs it as fast as they can. And that's what doesn't often happen with a lot of dogs. They will run the exact same path, but on a clock, they run the path faster in one repetition and slower in another. And that's because they are not driving for the jump.
Right.
They're not, and that comes back again to here, if we're saying your execution is good, and your dog's execution is good, this comes down to the driving on rear crosses.
Right. So in that sense, I think the rear cross actually takes a little bit more training than the front cross.
That's right. It takes training and it takes drive and confidence on the dog's part. They can't just know what's next. They have to want to go do it, ahead of the handler, to drive ahead of the handler. And for a lot of dogs, that's hard.
Certainly. And I think that's why in terms of selection, it really doesn't make too much sense to try to rear cross dogs that are slower and have drive issues. Certainly there are going to be good situations where even with a slow dog, you're coming in for a really late front, you're going to go off course, have a bad front very late. You definitely want to rear there, even if they don't love rear crosses. But for the most part, do your front crosses, stay ahead of dogs. And I think that's fine. But the crazy flip side of that is super fast dogs and handlers that never rear cross, because surely these dogs have the drive to do that. I think that's something. And kind of related to that, like no matter how good of a run that you throw up on Facebook or the internet, someone will notice, oh, hey, nice rear crossing or something like that. There's always going to be that one ignoramus who says, oh, what would the dog have done if you had done all fronts? I bet they would have gone even faster. I'm like, pretty sure for my dog that wouldn't have happened, because if they would have gone faster, I would have done that right. Because I want to go as fast as I possibly can. So, it is very dog dependent in that sense, but you can't let people put you off from rear crosses. Now, if you look at your dog and you say, okay, rear crosses aren't for me, totally fine.
Well, I would say totally fine with a caveat, and that is that I still think that it is worth developing the skill. Now, the thing that you said that is interesting is you said for these dogs that are a little bit slower, a little bit less drive, the handler can get up there. Well, that kind of answers the question right there. We were talking about fronts and how you need to be able to get up to the front and do it well with good timing and good position. Well, a handler who is faster than their dog, a dog who doesn't have quite as much speed as another dog, they're going to be able to do that in more spots, in maybe all the spots, right? But they can get to that spot. So it's not that the rules no longer apply for them. It's not that they don't have to ever do rears. It's just that there are, as you go through the different scenarios and one by one, handlers can no longer make that front cross and do it well. There are some handlers that can still make it, right? So they just have more front crosses available to them. But we do always push to develop multiple skills. And the reason is that as a course designer, if I'm a judge, if I'm designing a course, I can always put together a trap that will punish you if you force a front cross or if you choose to do a rear. I can, like any skill that you have that you only have one skill and you don't have any other way, I can put together a course that exposes that skill.
Oh, absolutely. If I go to an area where I know 90% of the handlers are rear cross dominant or super dominant, exactly. You can design a course that traps them and suddenly they're really far away from their dog for a critical piece of the course. And the flip side of that, you go to a place and it's all younger people who love to run around and stay ahead of their dog. You can easily design a course that crushes their soul and they're going to lose their run with some ridiculous off course at the very end, while some medium speed dog is going to simply do a basic rear cross and just win the entire class right there.
And once again, if Esteban and I ever become judges, we are never getting hired because of the things that we say on this podcast. But it's true. And the thing that I want people to realize is it's no fun to show up at a big event and to suddenly be faced with that trap, that moment where the skill that you have has been exposed.
Oh, yeah. You never want to show up and be like, I really want to do a front cross here, but I've never done a front cross with the tunnel so close.
Right.
I want to do a rear cross here, but there's a flick away trap here where if I try to rear cross, my dog's going to refuse the rear and just go and take this tunnel.
That's right. And so we always advocate practicing all the skills. And the way that we often do that is setting up sequences that we encounter in trials, setting them up at home and running them multiple ways, taping them, as we said, and timing them. You cannot go off of gut. You have to actually look at the time. And we want to identify what our preference is. We want to identify what our dog is best at. But we also want to try our second and our third option.
Mm-hmm. And you want to have some comfort level, and you want to have it before the big event.
That's right. And so the benefit of that is that you want to find out what's best for you and your dog. And sometimes you're surprised. Right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes what you thought was going to be best is not. Sometimes the thing that was your second choice actually runs really nicely, really smoothly. And the thing is, it's not universal. It's not like, front cross is always going to be better for me. You're going to find those angles, those speeds where the front cross is better, but under a different circumstance, the rear cross is better for you and your dog.
Right. Or sometimes they're pretty equivalent. You knew they were equivalent, but you just get a massive handling advantage from one or the other.
That's right. And the other reason that I like to do this is how we balance those skills. If we're choosing fronts most of the time, but if we go back and practice and we also practice the rear, our rear cross is going to get better through that practice, right?
Oh, yeah.
Until at some point where you do feel much more confident choosing whichever works best for the course. And that is going to open up your options when you go up against those tricky judges like Esteban and I.
Yeah, so I'm going to give you one of my super duper secrets right here. And it's this. I will pick courses, look at them and say, yeah, I could do lots of combinations here. I can do half rears, half fronts. I can do front rear. You know what? I'm just going to do all fronts and work on all my front crosses, my timing, my footwork, really focus on them. Pick another course and say, you know what? I'm just going to do this all rear crosses. That's just what I'm going to do. You know, maybe it's not ideal. This rear cross is really tough. Sometimes I'll do that. Oh, this is an easy rear cross and a tough front cross. I'm going to do the front cross. Or this is a very difficult rear cross. There's a lot of traps lying around here. I may not have as good a control, but you know what? I may run into this situation at nationals. I'm going to try it. And that's what I do. You know, that's how I use these local trial runs. And you know, that happened. Like, I think, the year I went to Westminster and made the finals, right? I think one course was front cross dominant. And I think the other one was rear cross. Like, I don't know, like I did a lot of rear cross. I remember doing a lot of rear crosses on one of those courses. And I just felt like at the actual event, the optimal move there was the rear cross. And so that's what I did. But you need to have that confidence from having done them all at the trials. Otherwise you go in and you're very nervous about your dog refusing the rear cross, your dog going off course from this front cross because you haven't been putting yourself in that situation on a weekly basis at your local trial. Or
in your practice yard. And that brings us to, before we wrap up, the Invitational Prep course. And this is the exact idea that we built this online course around. And that is find interesting or tricky sections from last year's event, put together exercises that people run through where they try, let's say, a front cross versus a rear cross versus a serpentine, or maybe versus a blind, where they basically try different handling options and see which works best for them and their dog.
Right. So I just gave you the super secret handling tip. And some of you are hearing that and saying, all right, well, that's good for you, Mr. Bad Dog Agility, but I'm not going to throw away my qualifying runs here at local trials. Well, now this is how you can do what I did, but in the comfort of your own backyard without losing those qualifying runs.
That's right. And we love this course because it's small space exercises. So the setup is really fast. They're real sequences, which I always like because the angles of jumps are in real life. Sometimes it's hard to replicate that when you're just setting up an exercise at home. You end up falling into patterns, making things perpendicular, or making things at comfortable angles. Whereas a lot of times the tricky spots in these national level courses are things that don't feel great. They don't feel great as a front. They don't feel great as a rear. You're really choosing between two uncomfortable options. And so we set those up in the backyard, and we tape those. We analyze them for our students. And then we also do course map analysis for that course, so that you're seeing the full course analysis. You're seeing one piece of the course as an exercise, something that you can set up at home. Once you have that set up, we do a nested sequence. It's just a little bit longer, maybe a little bit harder skills or a little bit more advanced skills for those finals courses that occasionally will throw something a little bit more advanced at competitors. We want you to be prepared when you actually make it through the first 4 rounds and you get to the finals. And there is, if you want, there is an option for video feedback from us. So we have that as part of the course. And this year, even more exciting, we have Jennifer Crank doing 2 of the rounds of this online course. So you'll be seeing her as well. And that is open for registration right now until Monday, November 6th. So this is your chance to kind of practice what we're preaching here.
Sure. The course is great. You've run at the Invitational multiple years. I've run at the Invitational, been in the finals. Jennifer's running the Invitational. She's going to be this year, this year, but as a coach, not as a competitor, coaching students. And so, there's a lot of experience here to draw on. And there's my two favorite feedbacks that we get from people who take the prep course is the sequence or thing that you designed or was talking about. It showed up in this year's course.
Oh, we've seen that multiple different times.
Like we laid out the exact hard sequence from that year's course. And so everybody basically got to practice it a whole bunch of times in advance. And then it was no big deal when they did at the Invitational. They knew exactly how to do it. They knew if they wanted to do rears or fronts, they already knew.
And that's just luck, but it happens.
Luck, I don't know how much is luck because there's only so many things a judge can do at these type events, given the space constraints, the equipment constraints, and the style, of course, that they're being asked to design. And so within that, we can make some really good educated guesses about what you're going to see. And so anyway, I like it when we nail it. I think that's happened multiple years where we get the exact sequence right. And then the other part is where someone says, I don't typically rear cross or I don't typically front cross, but I got a lot of confidence from your course. And then at the at the Invitational, the exact situation came up and I did it because I had the confidence from having done it in practice, even though I normally wouldn't have.
And it worked.
And it worked.
Right.
And they said, I would normally be very stressed out about that part. But with your feedback and the practice and everything, we worked through that. So that's my 2 favorite feedbacks that I get from the people who do the courses. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll give 2 really quick ones because they make me really happy too. One is the people who take the course and make the finals. And my favorite was an email that we got, a long email from a prep course student who it was her first year at the Invitational with her novice A dog. So she's only been in agility for a year or something. Novice A dog. First year going to the Invitational, she wanted to prepare, found our course and was like, well, that sounds like, I'm going to the Invitational. That sounds like a good idea. And she made the finals with her novice A dog her first year at the Invitational. I love that story. And then the second quick feedback that we got that I love was somebody who was like, I used this to prepare for my trial in New Zealand. Which is great because it really isn't specific to the Invitational. The Invitational is just the inspiration. So,
right, that's where we're pulling the sequences from, but all your basic concepts are going to be the same
wherever you trial in the world. So,
absolutely. So, to sum up the whole front cross versus rear cross thing, I think I almost want to speak to different audiences. And let me start by speaking to experienced competitors who have had multiple dogs or instructors. Right, you're in charge of students that have a wide variety of dogs in terms of speed and drive. And so I think a couple of key things to remember is that as long as the line is going to be the same between front and rear, the dog that executes them both well should have the same time. Okay. If they do not, it implies a deficiency in one or the other skill in that situation, whether it's the front or the rear, one of them probably needs a little bit of work. For low drive dogs or slower dogs that are barely making course time, that's really not the time in my opinion, to try and balance their front cross, rear cross ratio. If they're a front cross, blind cross, stay ahead of the dog kind of handler, that kind of a dominant handler, I think that's okay. There's going to be a couple spots where the rear cross is going to be a little bit better for them. You want to be wise to those spots, but overall, I wouldn't be out there hammering them on doing rear crosses, even though, I like rear crosses. On the other hand, for your students that have fast dogs, national level dogs, international level dogs, as uncomfortable as it makes them feel, they really need the rear cross skill. This is very apparent from watching the World Championships, European Open, USDA World Games, AKC Nationals. If you can't rear cross, okay, and you see blind cross is the new thing, but blind cross is the new front cross. Everybody's trying to blind cross. If you need to go check the mail, hey, do a blind cross. You'll get there faster. You'll check your mail faster. So, everybody's putting in these blind crosses. Some percent of them are going to be really bad placement, and that's all fine. That's how you push the edge of agility and really improve in handling. When you get to those championship events, you should be done experimenting and forcing things in. You should be running optimally. And optimally, a lot of times, you need the rear cross, and I think you're irresponsible as an instructor or top level handler to not equip your dog with a rear cross, to show up for some event and say, you know what, I just can't do that because I don't do those. You're holding yourself back. So I think that's something to keep in mind. And so as an instructor, experienced competitor, I think we all know the answer, as into many things in agility, is it depends, right? It depends. Now to the beginners, okay, you're going to get a lot of front cross, rear cross, and mostly people are just giving that advice based on what they think they see from you and your dog. Sometimes they're going to be right. Sometimes they're going to be wrong. Sometimes your instructor will be right or wrong, but that's what's happening there. And so just so you know, the same rules here apply. In theory, they should be the same as long as the path being run is the same, right? Equivalent, swap them out. We've showed this time and time again with a clock. All right. So I feel like, we have numbers and facts on our side, so that if someone makes a blanket statement to you that a front cross is always better, they are demonstrably wrong. Right. So that's a situation where I think you don't really bother arguing with the person. You just shake your head and be like, okay, have a nice day. I'm going to go train my dog now. But that's where that comes from. Just the idea that the front cross, you're doing something, you're going for it. I think all of us have fallen victim to that trap a time or two, and then, gotten hammered by somebody out there doing rear crosses. And I always love to remind people, one large dog handler, an American, won the Agility World Championship. I believe it was 2008. Everybody loves to talk about Lisa frickin' Haas. They inherited gold after this dog, but that's Marcus Thompson Juice. He's a rear cross dominant handler, very much so. Not that he didn't front, he did lots of fronts, but very rear cross dominant. But just that style of handling, I think, really fell out of favor internationally. But you're seeing it showing up in a lot of spots now as judges are looking for ways to make agility difficult for top competitors. And it turns out there's a gold mine here because people are resistant to doing rear crosses.
That's right. We wanted this podcast to kind of break down the different areas, because there's no one reason why a front cross or a rear cross may be better, or the fix for you and your dog. There's no one reason. There's several reasons, and you've got to look at your situation and figure out, what is holding you back on these other skills, on whatever skills you're not comfortable with. Well, that's it for today's podcast. We'd like to thank our sponsors, Elite Science, hititboard.com, and also Mighty Mite Dog Gear.
You want to make sure that your dog is safe when you're traveling to your next agility show. Go to mightymitenedoggear.com and buy the Vario Cage. It's the only car travel crate that has crumple zones designed to absorb energy from a collision. Visit mightymitenedoggear.com through November 12th for 15% off all Vario Cage products, plus free shipping. Make sure you check out mightymitenedoggear.com and protect your agility dog today. Happy training!
I wondered why the baseball was getting bigger. Then it hit me.